There is a moment in every life when silence becomes unbearable, when nothing seems to move, yet everything inside you feels restless, when the world looks the same, but you no longer are. This is not stagnation. This is pressure. And pressure always comes before a breakthrough. Here's the truth. Most people don't realize what looks like a sudden miracle from the outside is usually the result of a long, invisible preparation on the inside. You've been changing in ways no one could see. Your beliefs, your emotional boundaries, your tolerance for chaos, your refusal to stay small, and now the ground beneath your old life is starting to crack. People love the idea of sudden breakthroughs, overnight success, instant clarity, one moment of luck that changes everything. The mind is drawn to dramatic turning points because they feel hopeful, cinematic, and clean. But the truth is far less glamorous and far more demanding. What appears to be a sudden breakthrough is almost always the visible surface of a long, invisible process. The change looks instant only because the preparation was hidden. For a long time, the psyche works in the background. Beliefs are questioned quietly. Old emotional patterns weaken slowly. Perception shifts in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The conscious mind often feels stuck during this phase because it cannot see progress in tangible results. There is no clear milestone to celebrate, no applause, no external proof that anything meaningful is happening. Yet beneath the surface, internal structures are reorganizing. The person is becoming someone new long before the world recognizes it. This creates a dangerous illusion. When people witness someone else's sudden success, they compare it to their own long season of invisibility and conclude that they are failing. They assume the other person had luck, privilege, or a shortcut. What they do not see is the private labor of transformation, the years of inner conflict, the painful shedding of old identities, the countless moments of choosing growth over comfort. The breakthrough seems sudden only because the observer was not present for the internal struggle that made it possible. The psyche resists this slow preparation because it craves certainty and control. It wants clear cause and effect. It wants effort to be immediately rewarded. When this does not happen, discouragement sets in. The individual begins to doubt the value of inner work because it does not produce immediate external results. This doubt becomes a subtle form of self-sabotage. The person may abandon the very practices that are quietly building the foundation for future change simply because there is no quick validation. Another layer of the illusion is the belief that breakthroughs are events rather than thresholds. In reality, a breakthrough is not a single moment, but the crossing of an internal threshold. Pressure accumulates over time. Insights stack on top of one another. Emotional capacity increases gradually. Eventually, the internal structure reaches a point where the old way of being can no longer contain the new level of awareness. When that threshold is crossed, the outer world finally reflects the inner shift. To an outside observer, it looks like everything changed at once. To the person living it, it feels like the release of a long-held tension. There is also the matter of readiness. Opportunities often appear long before a person is capable of holding them. Without the necessary inner development, the same opportunity that could elevate someone may overwhelm them. What people call bad timing is frequently a mismatch between external possibility and internal capacity. The long period of unseen preparation is what aligns these two forces. It builds the emotional resilience, clarity, and responsibility needed to sustain the breakthrough once it arrives. The illusion of suddenness creates impatience. People start chasing dramatic moments instead of cultivating quiet consistency. They look for external signs of progress and overlook internal maturation. This leads to a cycle of excitement followed by collapse, because without a stable inner foundation, change cannot be integrated. The psyche requires time to rewire habits, reframe meaning, and develop new ways of relating to self and world. Skipping this process may produce brief highs, but it rarely produces lasting transformation. The more subtle truth is that nothing truly meaningful arrives unearned. The universe does not reward desire alone. It responds to capacity. Capacity is built in silence, in repetition, in inner confrontation, in the slow dismantling of limiting narratives. When the breakthrough finally becomes visible, it is not the beginning of the transformation, but the confirmation that the transformation has already occurred within. There is a distinct psychological tension that arises just before meaningful transformation occurs. It is not the dramatic chaos people imagine, but a heavy, quiet pressure that settles into everyday life. Nothing appears to change on the surface, yet internally everything feels strained, unresolved, and restless. The individual senses that the old ways of thinking, feeling, and living are no longer sufficient, but the new ways have not yet taken form. This creates an uncomfortable in-between state, a liminal space where the familiar no longer provides comfort, and the unknown has not yet revealed its shape. This tension often manifests as boredom, frustration, or a vague dissatisfaction with life. People describe feeling unmotivated, disconnected, or emotionally fatigued without a clear external reason. The mind searches for problems to explain the discomfort, attaching the tension to relationships, work, or circumstances. While these areas may indeed require change, the deeper source of the tension lies within. The psyche is reorganizing itself, loosening attachments to outdated identities and preparing for a more complex and integrated way of being. The discomfort is the sensation of internal structures being stretched beyond their previous limits. Psychologically, this period represents a confrontation between the known self and the emerging self. The known self is composed of habits, beliefs, coping strategies, and roles that once ensured safety and coherence. Over time, these structures become restrictive as awareness expands. The emerging self carries new values, deeper emotional range, and a broader sense of responsibility. The tension arises because both structures coexist for a time. The individual feels pulled in opposing directions, toward the safety of what is familiar and toward the uncertainty of what is becoming possible. This inner conflict drains energy and creates the sensation of being stuck. The ego often interprets this tension as failure. Because progress is not visible, the mind assumes regression. The person may judge themselves harshly for not feeling inspired, productive, or confident. This misinterpretation intensifies the tension by adding layers of self-criticism to an already demanding inner process. In reality, the psyche is conserving energy for a reconfiguration. Just as muscles tremble under strain before growing stronger, the inner life experiences pressure as it reorganizes its fundamental patterns. Another feature of this phase is the surfacing of unresolved emotional material. Old memories, fears, and suppressed feelings may arise unexpectedly. This is not a regression, but a necessary clearing. What was previously pushed aside now demands integration. The psyche brings these contents into awareness so they can be processed and incorporated into a more coherent whole. The tension increases as the individual faces aspects of themselves that were once denied or avoided. This confrontation is essential for transformation, yet it feels destabilizing because it disrupts the sense of a stable identity. Socially, this period can feel isolating. The individual may feel misunderstood or out of sync with others. Conversations that once felt natural may now seem superficial. Roles that once provided identity may feel empty. This is because the internal shift has already begun, even if it has not yet translated into visible changes. The person is outgrowing certain patterns of connection, but new forms of relatedness have not yet formed. The tension is amplified by the absence of external mirrors that reflect the emerging self. The impulse to escape this discomfort is strong. People may seek distraction, novelty, or quick solutions to relieve the pressure. Yet avoiding the tension delays the transformation. The tension is not an obstacle to growth, it is the medium through which growth occurs. It signals that the psyche is reorganizing at a deeper level than conscious will alone can manage. Allowing the tension to be felt without immediately trying to resolve it creates space for the new configuration to emerge. This phase demands patience and self-compassion. It requires the capacity to remain present with uncertainty without forcing premature conclusions. The mind wants clarity, direction, and reassurance. But transformation unfolds according to an inner rhythm that cannot be rushed without distortion. The tension is the felt experience of inner limits being exceeded, of old meanings losing their grip, of new possibilities struggling to take shape within the constraints of former structures. Before any genuine expansion of consciousness can occur, there is an encounter with what has been avoided, denied, or repressed. This encounter is often described as shadow work, a process in which the hidden aspects of the psyche come into awareness. These aspects are not inherently negative, yet they are experienced as threatening because they challenge the self-image a person has constructed. The personality prefers coherence and moral clarity, so anything that contradicts the chosen identity is pushed into the background. Over time, this disowned material gathers emotional charge and seeks expression in indirect ways. Shadow work begins when the individual becomes aware of recurring patterns that cause suffering. These patterns may appear as repeated conflicts in relationships, self-sabotaging behaviors, irrational emotional reactions, or persistent feelings of shame and resentment. The conscious mind often projects these qualities onto others, judging and condemning them externally rather than recognizing them internally. This projection offers temporary relief but prevents integration. The work begins when responsibility is taken for these reactions, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of ownership of inner dynamics. The psyche resists this process because it threatens the stability of the ego. To admit the presence of envy, aggression, dependency, or vulnerability disrupts the narrative of being a certain kind of person. Yet growth requires precisely this disruption. The hidden aspects of the self carry energy, creativity, and instinctual intelligence that have been locked away to maintain a socially acceptable image. When these aspects are brought into awareness, the individual gains access to a fuller range of inner resources. The fear associated with shadow work often masks a deeper fear of losing control over the carefully constructed persona. As shadow material surfaces, emotional turbulence increases. Feelings that were previously muted or displaced may become intense and immediate. This intensity can feel destabilizing, as if one's inner world has become chaotic. The mind may interpret this as deterioration rather than development. However, this phase reflects a temporary disorganization necessary for deeper reorganization. The psyche is loosening rigid defenses that once ensured survival, but now limit growth. This loosening allows for a more flexible and integrated structure of personality to emerge. A common misunderstanding is that shadow work is about eliminating undesirable traits. In truth, it is about relating to them consciously. Aggression, for example, can be transformed, add into assertiveness. Dependency can be transformed into the capacity for intimacy. Vulnerability can become emotional depth. When these qualities remain unconscious, they control behavior from behind the scenes. When they are acknowledged, they become available for conscious choice. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse, but understanding the psychological function it serves and finding more adaptive expressions for its energy. This process often brings a confrontation with moral complexity. The individual realizes that they are capable of thoughts and feelings that contradict their ideals. This realization can provoke guilt or shame. If handled defensively, it may lead to further repression. If approached with curiosity and compassion, it becomes an opportunity for maturation. The psyche grows not by maintaining an image of purity, but by holding contradictions without fragmenting. This capacity to contain inner opposites increases psychological resilience and depth. Shadow work also alters how one perceives others. As projections are withdrawn, judgments soften. Traits that once provoked strong reactions in others are recognized as mirrors of one's own disowned aspects. This recognition does not eliminate discernment, but it reduces the compulsion to externalize inner conflict. Relationships become less reactive and more grounded in mutual recognition of complexity. The world appears less divided into heroes and villains and more populated by psychologically intricate individuals navigating their own inner tensions. The notion of ascension, understood psychologically, refers to an expansion of awareness and capacity rather than an escape from human complexity. There is no rising above the shadow without first descending into it. Attempts to bypass this descent lead to inflated self-concepts that are fragile and easily destabilized. True elevation of consciousness is grounded, embodied, and ethically nuanced. It rests on the integration of instinct, emotion, and reason into a more coherent whole. The individual becomes less driven by unconscious compulsion and more capable of reflective choice, not because darker aspects have disappeared, but because they have been brought into a conscious relationship with the rest of the psyche. There comes a point in psychological development when the identity that once provided stability begins to feel restrictive rather than protective. What used to organize life, roles, beliefs, ambitions, coping strategies, no longer fits the inner reality that has been quietly evolving. This is not usually experienced as liberation at first. More often it feels like disorientation, loss of direction, or a vague sense that the ground beneath one's feet is no longer reliable. The old identity does not vanish politely. It fractures under pressure, and the pressure comes from growth that can no longer be contained within its limits. An identity is not just a story we tell about ourselves. It is a structure that shapes perception, behavior, and emotional responses. It determines what feels possible and what feels forbidden. For a long time, this structure is necessary. It provides coherence and predictability. It helps the individual navigate social expectations and internal conflicts. But as awareness expands, the same structure that once offered safety becomes a cage. The collapse begins when the individual can no longer fully believe in the narrative that once defined them. This collapse is often triggered by life transitions, failures, losses, or moments of unexpected insight. A career path loses meaning. A relationship no longer reflects who one has become. Values that once felt solid begin to feel borrowed or outdated. The mind tries to repair the old identity by doubling down on familiar strategies, but these efforts feel forced and exhausting. The energy that once sustained the persona is no longer available because it has already been redirected towards something new that has not yet taken form. Emotionally, this phase can resemble depression or anxiety, though its deeper function is different. There is grief for the person one used to be, even if that person was limited or constrained. There is fear of the unknown because the old coordinates no longer apply. The individual may feel empty, unmotivated, or strangely detached from goals that once seemed essential. This is not a failure of will, but a reorganization of meaning. The psyche is withdrawing investment from outdated structures to free energy for a new configuration. Socially, the collapse of an old identity can be unsettling. Relationships are often built around shared roles and expectations. When one person changes internally, the relational dynamics shift as well. Some connections may feel strained or superficial, others may fall away entirely. This is not necessarily a rejection of others, but a sign that the inner reference point has moved. The individual may struggle to explain this shift because it is experienced more as a change in orientation than as a clear communicable decision. The mind tends to interpret this in-between state as a problem to be solved quickly. It looks for a new label, a new plan, a new identity to replace the old one. Yet premature reconstruction often leads to repeating the same pattern with different surface details. The collapse serves a purpose. It creates a space of not knowing in which deeper values and capacities can emerge. This space is uncomfortable because it lacks clear definitions, but it is precisely this lack of definition that allows something more authentic to take shape. During this period, previously ignored aspects of the self often come forward. Interests that were dismissed as impractical, emotions that were suppressed to maintain a certain image, or needs that were sacrificed for approval may demand attention. The old identity collapses because it can no longer hold the full complexity of the person. What emerges is not a completely new self, but a more inclusive and flexible organization of the psyche that can integrate these neglected elements. There is also a shift in how success and failure are experienced. External achievements lose some of their emotional charge, while inner coherence becomes more important. The individual begins to measure life less by performance and more by alignment. This does not mean withdrawing from the world, but engaging with it from a different center of gravity. Actions become guided less by the need to maintain a certain image and more by the need to remain truthful to an evolving inner reality. The collapse of an old identity is not a single event, but a process that unfolds in waves. Each wave dismantles another layer of outdated self-definition and exposes a deeper level of motivation and fear. The person learns to tolerate ambiguity, to live without a fixed answer to the question of who they are, and to trust that coherence will eventually re-emerge in a more resilient form, not as a rigid structure, but as a dynamic relationship to their own unfolding experience, where certainty is replaced by responsiveness and control gives way to a more nuanced sense of direction, shaped by insight rather than habit, and where the self is no longer a mask to be defended, but a process to be lived through with awareness and responsibility for what is still becoming. Preparation is commonly misunderstood as the accumulation of external advantages, plans, strategies, resources, and perfectly timed moves. While these have their place, they address only the surface level of readiness. At a deeper psychological level, preparation is an inner process of alignment. It is the gradual ordering of values, intentions, and emotional capacities, so that when change arrives, the individual can meet it without fragmentation. External control seeks to manage outcomes. Inner alignment seeks to develop the person who will encounter those outcomes. The desire for external control arises from uncertainty. The mind wants guarantees that effort will lead to predictable results. It responds to ambiguity by constructing elaborate plans and contingency measures, believing that if enough variables are managed, discomfort can be avoided. Yet life consistently undermines this belief. Unforeseen events disrupt even the most carefully designed strategies. When preparation is rooted solely in external control, these disruptions are experienced as threats to stability rather than invitat. Ions to adapt. The individual becomes anxious not because change occurs, but because their sense of security was invested in an illusion of manageability. Inner alignment shifts the focus from controlling circumstances to cultivating coherence within the self. This coherence involves clarity of values, emotional regulation, and a realistic relationship to one's own limits and capacities. A person who is aligned internally can respond flexibly to changing conditions because their sense of identity does not depend on specific outcomes. They are not defined by whether a plan succeeds or fails, but by how consciously they engage with what unfolds. This does not remove difficulty, but it changes the quality of engagement with difficulty. A key element of inner alignment is the integration of intention and action. Many people experience internal conflict because their stated goals do not match their deeper motivations. They may pursue paths that align with social expectations while neglecting their own values. This misalignment generates chronic tension and drains energy. Preparation at the inner level involves recognizing these contradictions and gradually reorganizing one's life around what is genuinely meaningful rather than what is merely approved. When intention and action are brought into closer harmony, effort becomes less forced and more sustainable. Emotional readiness is another dimension of inner alignment. Opportunities often demand capacities that have not yet been developed. Success can bring increased responsibility, visibility, and pressure. Without emotional grounding, these demands can overwhelm, leading to impulsive decisions or defensive withdrawal. Preparation involves cultivating the ability to tolerate uncertainty. to remain present with discomfort, and to regulate emotional reactions under stress. This emotional capacity cannot be acquired through planning alone. It is developed through repeated engagement with challenging inner states and the gradual expansion of tolerance for complexity. There is also a moral dimension to inner alignment. As awareness deepens, the individual becomes more sensitive to the ethical implications of their choices. External control tends to prioritize efficiency and advantage, sometimes at the expense of integrity. Inner alignment requires an ongoing dialogue with one's conscience, an examination of the values that guide behavior. This alignment does not guarantee moral perfection, but it creates a framework for reflective responsibility. The person becomes less likely to sacrifice long-term coherence for short-term gain, because the cost of such sacrifice is felt internally as dissonance. The paradox of preparation is that the more one aligns inwardly, the less one feels the need to control outwardly. This does not lead to passivity, but to a different quality of agency. Action arises from responsiveness rather than compulsion. Decisions are made with an awareness of both inner truth and outer reality. The individual is prepared not because every outcome has been anticipated, but because their inner structure is flexible enough to reorganize in response to whatever emerges. This flexibility is rooted in self-knowledge, emotional resilience, and a realistic acceptance of limits. When preparation is grounded in inner alignment, change is not experienced as an intrusion into a carefully managed system, but as an extension of an ongoing process of becoming. The person does not cling rigidly to prior expectations, nor do they collapse when those expectations are unmet. They remain oriented by values rather than outcomes, by presence rather than prediction, by coherence rather than control.